I'm now going to continue my video series on Henry Ward Beecher and his sermons with the Thanksgiving holiday. Now, I know there are some of you out there who are going to be sitting here going, wait, what? Didn't we just celebrate Easter? Well, that's true. But many people believe that there are similarities between the Thanksgiving holiday and the Passover feast that we're supposed to be celebrating over Easter. Let's get into this, shall we? Now, few people doubt that Abraham is the father of Isaac, and most Christians agree that the Israelite nation began with Abraham and Isaac. But do these facts have anything to do with the Thanksgiving holiday? Well, let's find out. No one gave more thanks than Moses did when he, his friends, and his family celebrated the first Passover feast. Remember, Moses was a descendant of Abraham and Isaac. God set the Israelites free from 400 years of bondage. But do Christians celebrate this feast today? Some Christians seem to be more interested in colored eggs and bunnies than they are in this God-established feast. They forget that Jesus celebrated the Passover feast throughout his entire life. I guarantee that all Christians will celebrate this feast in the afterlife. I guess we'll just have to wait and see now, won't we? Now, give me just a second here. I have to get something to drink. I'm thirsty here. Oh, hang on. There we go. I tend to get thirsty from time to time. That's better. There is nothing wrong with celebrating a feast and giving thanks for everything you have. There is nothing wrong with Christian fellowship. There is something wrong in leaving God out of your celebration. The Pilgrims hosted a God-centered feast when they celebrated their first Thanksgiving. If you study the Thanksgiving feast carefully, you will notice similarities between this feast and the Passover feast, which I just said a minute ago. Okay? Alright. Were the Puritans and Pilgrims opposed to celebrating holidays? No, not really. Their attitude towards holidays were the same as our attitudes to celebrating Nazi holidays. So what's the Nazis got to do with any of this? Hold on. What Christian in their right mind would celebrate the birthday of Adolf Hitler? None. No Christian would dare celebrate the Nazi Easter Monday. We wouldn't do that. The reason Christians don't celebrate these holidays is very obvious. Hitler was an oppressive tyrant. In the same way, first-century Christians didn't celebrate Roman holidays. Puritans and Pilgrims didn't celebrate pagan British holidays. Puritans and Pilgrims had no interest in celebrating Christmas the same way as King George III did. What did King George III know anything about the birth of Christ, or anything else for that matter? Oh, he may have known the text, but to know it in his heart is a different story. How can you oppress your fellow man and worship Jesus? It doesn't work that way. And that's what I'm talking about here. Okay. No real Christian is destitute by choice. Often this kind of poverty is caused by a lack of education. Observe the first century Jews living in Galilee. Were they properly educated? I wouldn't go that far with it. Some of them were, but most of them were not. Could they obtain a decent education? Well, back in those days, they didn't have free public education as we do today. Okay? You actually had to pay to read and write and do all that other stuff. Yeah. And with their salaries, they couldn't afford it. Okay? Well, usually not. Sometimes they could, but most of the time, no. Okay? The education system of the Roman Empire was radically different than the education system we have today. It was very basic. If you couldn't pay for the education, you didn't get any of the education. The Jews in Galilee were oppressively taxed, so how could they afford a decent education? Well, they just couldn't. Okay. And I apologize, I have a little indigestion, so bear with me. Though our education system is free, it often fails to give children the kind of education they need to thrive in this society. Is this always the teacher's fault? Not necessarily. Maybe you should read the textbooks that your children bring home every day. It's more likely that the textbooks are more responsible for your children's lack of education than the teacher is. And I kid you, read these textbooks, you'll be surprised. That's because very few people compete with these textbooks. But I compete with them every day on my YouTube channel. I know this sounds like a plug, but really, this is something that needs to be dealt with. We are having the same problem in our society as the first century Jews did in ancient Israel. That is no joke. And I referred to that when I covered the book Prophet and Teacher by William Herzog. You can watch those videos anytime you want. Okay? Puritans and Pilgrims also believed in education, and once they established their colonies, they rarely experienced poverty. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't impoverished either. The settlers didn't experience poverty until the British Empire started imposing excessive taxes on them. And that's a fact. Now, you don't have to be wealthy to be a Christian. But if you're destitute, you're potentially sending a message that God can't provide for your basic needs. And this is something first century Jews living in Galilee struggle with every day. This is something some Christians are struggling with today. That's one of the reasons why I created my YouTube channel. I know it sounds again like a plug, but I am trying to solve the problem that we're facing today in the same way that it could have been solved for those first century Jews living in Galilee. Education, good education, gets you out of poverty. That's how it works. Okay? Because you don't want people to think that God can't take care of us. And the best way to do that is to get a good education. When you have a good education, you have a better chance of obtaining wealth. That doesn't guarantee anything, but you do have a better chance. Okay? Remember, it's not about being wealthy, it's about being destitute. No Christian should be totally destitute. That should never happen. Pilgrims and Puritans believed in hard work, and so do I. They didn't believe in unfulfilling work. They believed that if you build a table, then someone will eventually buy that table for a decent price. Okay, now think about this for a second. What child in their right mind would mow a yard without being compensated for his work? Think about this for a second. I wouldn't have created my YouTube channel if I thought that no one was going to watch my videos. All people feel a need to be compensated for their hard work. God infused this particular characteristic in every person who is alive today and every person that has ever lived. Okay? Now, what makes the Thanksgiving holiday so special? It's not a romantic holiday. It doesn't focus on presents and generosity like Christmas or Easter does. It's not a patriotic holiday. It doesn't honor a specific group of people. And it doesn't memorialize any events. It's just a holiday that focuses on what Jesus thought was very important. It focuses on family and unity. It focuses on fellowship and God-established morality. That's what Thanksgiving is really all about. Now think about this for a second. Have you ever tried to share a meal with someone you despise? That goes over well. It's very difficult indeed. How many treaties and business contracts have been successfully created around a table full of food? Food and fellowship are often interlinked. Hang on just a second. I'm thirsty again. I know. Bear with me. Okay. Now, why did Jesus... Okay, let me try that again. Why did Jesus think family was so important? Without families, nations no longer grow and prosper. And without families, churches no longer grow and prosper. That's a fact. If married couples don't produce children, then who will become the next church shepherds? Who will become the next church treasurers? Who will visit those who are ill? Who will build future churches or maintain the churches already in existence? Now do you see why Jesus thought families were so important? Alright, now there are two types of weather that can put a family relationship to the ultimate test. The first is extreme heat of summertime. Now, see how a family interacts while they are huddled in an air-conditioned room. Now, back in the old days, that wasn't even a big deal because they would just go outside because it was just too hot to sit indoors. Okay? But nowadays, they just sit and huddle around that air conditioner. And I assure you, yeah, that could put a strain on. Now, here's the other thing. The other type of weather is the bitter cold. Sure, family members can drive to shops, movie theaters, museums, or parks, even in the summertime. But when you're talking about ice and snow and frigid temperatures, well, that can hamper the ability of family members to go wherever they wish. Therefore, they often find themselves huddled around fireplaces and heaters in the wintertime. And when the winter weather snaps power lines, family relationships can be seriously strained, especially in this particular generation with people having so many smartphones and tablets. See where I'm going with this? So, extreme weather is one of the tools God can actually use to test the strength of family relationships. Never thought about that, huh? I can't think of a better time to celebrate a family holiday than at the beginning of wintertime. Think about that. The beginning of the time when it gets cold and wet and windy and you can't just go out and do whatever you darn well please type thing. I can't think of a better time to have a Thanksgiving holiday. To give thanks for all those people that are still in your life and that you have still a decent relationship with. It makes you assess what kind of a person you are and what kind of people you have around you. This holiday tests family ties. Will a family grow through compromise or will it destroy itself? Name one other holiday that tests the unity of a family. People will often name the Christmas or Easter holiday. But remember one thing about these holidays. For some families, unity can be brought with gifts. No one can say the same thing about a Thanksgiving holiday. You can't bribe your family on Thanksgiving. You can at Christmas, you can at Easter. But Thanksgiving, no, not a chance. Okay? Now, family fathers are usually considered the heads of the households. Now, I know in this day and age, you have the mothers or the young ladies who just kind of assume the role, that kind of thing. But traditionally speaking, especially if you're talking about in ancient times, the family father was usually the head of the household. So I understand and totally comprehend that that's kind of not the same way it is in modern times, but back then that's what way it was. But let's look carefully at mothers. How many people would say that mothers are great negotiators? Just talk to a few of them, they'll tell you. Okay? A great negotiator is intelligent, wise, and very observant. This is a great description of many mothers. Not everybody, but many of them. Okay? However, Some men are apprehensive about ladies having the right to vote or earn their own income. They are worried that ladies will lose their femininity if they gain the same rights as men. Oh, this is a myth. God infused femininity into the DNA of all ladies. Granting them voting rights will never change this. Giving them the ability to earn their own income is not going to change this either. And just because they drive a car, does that change their femininity? Absolutely not. Ladies can have lots of friends, participate in athletic events, wear drab clothing, and possess multiple college degrees, but they will always be feminine. It's just the way it is. Okay? Now the same thing can be said of men. Men can cook, sew, shop for groceries, and even assist in caring for children, but they will still be men. God infused masculinity in the DNA of all men. No external activity will change the nature of men. The same is said of ladies. You don't change who you are just because you do certain things. Okay? It's not the things you do that make you who you are. It's the character within that makes you who you are. It's the God-infused character inside of you that really makes you who you are. Therefore, young ladies should be encouraged to learn, to vote, to maintain physical fitness, and to even earn their own income. They should be encouraged to drive, participate in extracurricular activities, and I could go on and on and on. Men should never be afraid to grant rights to ladies. A lady can wear a combat uniform one day and a glittering dress the next. This means that neither clothes nor any external activities of ladies compromises their femininity. So get over it, guys. Doesn't happen that way. It also means that their service to God shouldn't be measured by their gender. Gender does not impede God's will. God does not take a person's gender into consideration when He decides what He wants them to do. God only considers their willingness to serve Him, and of course their capabilities, because God infuses capabilities in every single person. That's what He takes into consideration. He doesn't consider your nationality. He doesn't consider your gender. He doesn't consider your weight, your height, nothing like that. He only considers what you're capable of and what you're willing to do to serve Him. That's all He cares about. So are there things that can destroy a family? Well, of course there are. The biggest thing that can destroy a family is poor education. Let me tell you something. Some of the biggest fights that occur in families is only due to a poor education. That's a fact. I have said this many times before. God will not persuade an accounting firm to hire you if you don't possess accounting skills. God will not give you an opportunity to work at a retail shop if you can't even count change. That's the way it works. One of the biggest things that can destroy a family is finances. And why does that happen? Because they're earning a poor income. Why does that happen? Because of a lack of education. I've said that so many times before. So I shouldn't have to say it again, but I probably will at some point. Now, how does this affect the future of a family? If a young couple can't earn a decent income, they won't pursue romantic relationships. I mean, think about it for a second. What young lady would marry any young guy who cannot financially support her, not all the time? Okay, this isn't about like the 1950s here. We're talking about women do get pregnant and they do have children, and during that period of time they may need the guy to financially support them until they can get back on their feet. If a guy can't do that during certain periods of time in their life, they're not going to marry him. I mean, what young lady, honestly speaking, marries a homeless guy? Doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. That's where my thinking is. Okay? Now, if they don't pursue a romantic relationship, they also don't consider marriage. And this means that they won't plan to raise children. This could sterilize a multi-generational family. Come on, if all the sons and daughters of a particular family decide not to get married because of their poor finances, there goes the family tree. Gone. That's not good. And people should remember that many church congregations are founded on families. Now, yes, you do want new membership. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the core of many churches is based on growing families. If the family stops growing, the church stops growing. Pretty much. Now, yes, you can always get new membership as far as that's concerned, but if enough families stop growing, that church is going to go bye-bye. That's the way it works. Can this problem be fixed? Absolutely. I'm doing it right here on this YouTube channel every single day. But there are so-called shepherds. Let me say that again. So-called shepherds. That's in the Bible, Jesus called ministers shepherds. Well, there are these fake shepherds. They're not real shepherds, because real shepherds would never do this. But there are so-called fake shepherds that do stuff like this. Now think about this. They will literally tell young people that the reason why they're single and the reason why that they're poor is because God wills it. God does not will you to be poor, and He does not will you to be single, both of which are lies. And if any fake shepherd ever tells you that, walk away. They are not preaching the gospel of Christ. Christ does want you to get married, and He does want you to prosper. Of course, He wants you to get married at His timing, not yours, and He wants you to get married to the right person, not just to anybody, and He also wants you to prosper. And you say, well, there are some people that just don't get married. Okay, only in a rare few exceptions does God say, hey, you know what, maybe it's not such a great idea that you get married, maybe there's some extra complications, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, that's what God wants for you. Okay? Now again, I say, there are a lot of people that stand there and say, well, it's not a sin to be single. That's true. It's not really a sin to be single. But that's not, in most cases, that's not what God wants for you. Okay? Now, they'll stand there and say, well, not all people are destined to be married. Well, there are a rare few exceptions where God says, okay, I'd rather you do this than get married. Once in a while that happens, but the majority of the time that's just not the case. After all, God gave Adam Eve. Enough said. So, the majority of the time, God does want you to get married. But He wants you to do it at His time. He wants you to do it with the spouse He provides for you. And He wants you to do it when you are financially stable to do so. That's a lot of factors. See what I mean? Now, there is a big difference between God motivating you to stay single and some so-called shepherd standing there uttering an ignorant statement like, well, it just was meant to be. How does that reverend know that? Did God tell him that? Not necessarily. The matter of getting married or staying single is a matter between you and God. It has nothing to do with Him whatsoever. You know why these so-called reverends do that? because they're trying to put you off. Well, you're not my problem. That's why they're doing that. Don't listen to them. They have no authority from God to do that. It would be better for them to say, just listen to your heart. Listen to what God is telling you. And let Him show you who you're supposed to get married to, if at all, and under what circumstances. Let God guide your life. It would be better that they say something like that than to say, oh, I just guess it was meant to be. You know, when they say it like that, what they're actually doing is they're saying, I don't want anything to do with this. You're in my way. Get lost. That's what they're saying. So don't listen to these so-called shepherds. What do they know? Unless God told them, and usually He didn't, they don't know a thing. They're clueless, and you don't need to be listening to them. Okay? Think about this. How do these so-called shepherds know what God's will is for your life? Especially when they have not even examined your life. They barely know you. And then they're trying to give you this kind of advice? Really? Did they test the people that they're giving advice to see how intelligent they were? Did they evaluate their potential job future? Did they evaluate their relationship capabilities? Usually not. They'll probably talk to you for about maybe 5 or 10 minutes and suddenly come to the conclusion. Don't let them do that to you. Once a reverend really gets to know you, then maybe he could give you that kind of advice. But unless he really gets to know you, don't listen to him. Okay? Now, is God pleased with these so-called shepherds giving you horrible advice like, well, I guess it was just meant to be? No, He's not. And God will judge these so-called shepherds for giving poor advice on the basis that they didn't really get to know you and they didn't get to really know the Bible before giving you any advice. And God will judge them for that. Alright. Always keep in mind that God created and married Adam and Eve. He didn't just create Adam and Eve, He married them. So God definitely wants the majority of this human race to get married. But on His terms. Finding the right person. Being under the right circumstances. So on and so forth. The only person who should decide whether you remain single or married is God. Nobody else. And when a reverend is making that, and not just any reverend, we're talking about these so-called shepherds. When these so-called shepherds are trying to make that decision for God, God judges that. He won't tolerate it. Okay? And these so-called reverends should think about this before giving that kind of advice. Alright. Now, why is employment and good money management so critical to young couples? Think about where these young couples are supposed to live. Do you want a recently married couple to live in a rat-infested, drafty house? Do you want these young couples exposed to mold and other diseases that can be found in low-cost housing or low-rent apartments? Do you want young couples to live with their parents or their in-laws only because they can't afford to rent or buy a place of their own? If you don't want that to happen, educate them. Educate them so they don't have to face anything like that. And that can be done. Now think about this for a second. What food do you want these young couples to eat? Do you want them to consume a constant diet of food full of sugar, unhealthy fat, and salt? Do you want them to develop preventable health conditions like diabetes or heart disease due to their inability to purchase healthy food? If they can't care for themselves, how will they ever be able to care for any children that they have? It won't happen. Now, many of these young couples also feel additional pressure. They want to entertain guests. But how can they do that if they don't possess decent furniture? How can they do that if they can't afford decent food for themselves, let alone for their guests? It doesn't work that way. If they can't afford decent housing or decent food, if they can't afford decent housing or decent food, how can they afford decent clothing? If they can't afford decent clothing, they can't obtain or maintain decent employment. It doesn't work that way. And this spirals their lives into deeper poverty and hopelessness. This is one of the main reasons marriages don't last very long. The endless financial fights, easily preventable by education. And that's a fact. I've said this before and I will say it again. Young people have a very slim chance of obtaining decent employment without a decent education. And how do they obtain this education if their parents can't afford to send them to a decent college? That's why I post videos to YouTube. I bridge the gap between non-affluent young people, and I know my thing keeps jumping around, and the education that they need so badly. And I never tell anyone that God meant for them to be single without thoroughly examining their situation first. In other words, I, unlike these so-called shepherds, will never brush you off. Now, another thing you have to think about is that these young ladies become accustomed to a certain way of life when they live with their parents. If they fall in love with someone who can't provide them with that lifestyle that they have become so accustomed to, it can place a serious strain on their marriage. How can a husband provide a lifestyle that their future spouse has become accustomed to? Sometimes these ladies need to set their standards. Sometimes these ladies set their standards too high, and they need to learn how to compromise a little bit. However, most husbands just need a better education so they can obtain decent employment. And as I said before, I bridge this gap with my YouTube videos. Alright, so maybe these so-called reverends should share my YouTube web address. Might keep those young couples together a little bit better. Will a decent education guarantee decent employment? Not necessarily. Husbands and wives must realize that poor attitudes and their poor relationship with God can keep them from obtaining decent employment. On the other hand, a decent education can improve their relationship with God and with each other. And once their relationship with God improves, so will their attitudes. That's the reason a decent education is so important. Now that's all I've got to say for tonight. I know that was an awful long presentation, but anyway, let's just close this up for now. I will tell you more in a future video, so I'd like for you to stay tuned.